Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar entitled Building a Canadian Strategy for Early COVID-19 Treatments. My name is Kathy Medjury. I'm Vice President Policy at the Chamber and I'll be moderating this session. Health Canada has approved a number of early treatments for COVID-19 that can prevent hospitalization and deaths for the patients most at risk. More treatments are also underway by Health Canada. In addition to vaccination, rapid testing, and other public health strategies, the effective deployment of early treatment options can relieve pressures on our healthcare system, as well as support sustained business recovery. A number of countries have adopted strategies to support and accelerate the implementation of early COVID-19 treatments, including building awareness. While Canada has taken some steps in this regard, currently, there's no such national strategy. Please join us today for a discussion with clinicians and experts from Canada and other jurisdictions to discuss what such a strategy could look like in Canada and the implications for business and the economy. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to remind the audience that we will have a Q&A session at the end. So if you want to start putting questions in, please go to slido.com. That's the platform we're using. You're probably familiar with it by now. And the code to enter is 345321. So slido.com, 345321. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists for today, Dr. Zain Chagla, who is Associate Professor of Medicine at McMaster University, Dr. Stephen Tong, infectious disease physician with the Victorian Infectious Diseases Services and co-head translational and clinical research at the Doherty Institute at the University of Melbourne, and Mark Agnew, Senior Vice President, Policy and Government Relations at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. We're going to start with an overview of the situation in Canada. So turn it over to you, Dr. Chagla. Can you tell us a little bit about the different types of treatments that are out there, how they work, who they're destined for, and generally, what is the availability of these treatments here in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to just throw up a few slides here quickly, just to walk through kind of where we are in Canada and the therapeutic pathway in Canada. And we'll just intro in terms of how these work in general. So everyone can hopefully see my slides here. We obviously know COVID is here in Canada. We've had an explosion of cases that is settling down. But I think the more important thing is this part where even with vaccines, and vaccines have done an incredible job in protecting against severe outcomes, especially in this Omicron wave. God knows what this would have looked like if we did not have vaccines at the time. But we are not ignorant of the healthcare costs during this interval and how much that pressure has then had rippling effects on the economy, on restrictions, et cetera. And so, there's an important frame here in terms of how to avoid this in the future, especially as we recognize that COVID-19 is going to be a part of our ecosystem for a while. And again, you can see that, again, vaccines are an important, probably the most important tool, but you do see hospitalizations and deaths amongst those who are fully vaccinated, particularly those who are very vulnerable, immune compromised, where they may not get the effects of a vaccine totally. And certainly there are a lower component of those who require healthcare utilization, but certainly they are a component as well that needs to be considered along with unvaccinated population. When we talk about treatments, there are really two phases of infection that we see with COVID-19, and this is actually similar to other respiratory tract infections. So early on, much of the damage is done by the virus itself. The virus replicates in cells, it causes damage every time it replicates. And those changes are the kind of the first 7 days of the illness. Those are the fevers, muscle aches, feeling unwell. Some of that is the immune system reacting to the virus. But this is when the virus is high and causing most of its damage. Then, as things go on in the infection, we start seeing inflammation. So our body's response to the virus causing more of the damage, especially as people get moderate to severe COVID-19 that lands them in hospital and lands them in the ICU. And so the treatment paradigm in hospital is actually very different than the treatment paradigm in the community. When people make it to hospital, we often give them medications to settle down their immune system, to actually suppress their immune system, because that's what's leading to the damage. But we obviously recognize that if we give therapy towards the virus early, particularly within the first week of the infection, that likely will then help clear the virus quicker, which then leads to better outcomes and less of that post-inflammatory phase, which often is what leads to people ending up quite sick in the hospital. So, again, this is where the benefit of new therapies over the last year have really helped in terms of mitigating the worst outcomes amongst individuals who are at high risk. So, I'm not going to go through this particularly, but we have different places where these therapies work. They work as the virus gets into the cell, they work as the virus is making its proteins, and they work as the virus is making its genetics. But the point of this being is there are different targets for the virus at different points. And again, these therapies work best early when the virus is replicating in high quantities to shut this down, as compared to later when, again, much of the damage isn't from the virus, it's from the immune system going a bit haywire in response to the virus. And so when we give early therapy, it interferes with the virus before it kind of completes that life cycle. It means less replication, less inflammation, and again, better outcomes for patients. So we see a number of clinical trials for these therapies. I'll talk about what's approved in Canada and what may be coming to Canada. But given to the highest risk patients, so these are patients who are immunocompromised, many of these trials were done before vaccines, but unvaccinated patients who are older, who have medical conditions, given to those patients, you see marked reductions in hospitalization rates. Some of the trials, 30% in the trials, 70 to 80% reductions in hospitalizations if given early to patients. And that, equates to a lower risk of ICU, a lower risk of being on a mechanical ventilator, a lower risk of death. But the biggest paradigm piece of this is that they must be given early. These therapies have a 5 to 7 day window into the infection where they're going to affect the prognosis and the natural history of these patients. After that point, you start seeing the inflammation take over. And again, you may not be able to stop it with this type of therapy. And so these are the drugs that are available in or coming to the market in Canada, going through approval. We have sotrovimab, which is a monoclonal antibody. So these are synthetic antibodies to COVID-19 that help with blocking the virus from entering the body. These are given as an intravenous, as a single infusion. And again, data generated in Canada, as well as the rest of the world, saw a 70 to 80% reduction in hospitalization amongst individuals that got this drug within the first 5 days of their symptoms. We have Paxlovid, which is the Pfizer compound, which I think we've all heard about recently approved in Canada about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and is starting to be distributed. This is works on the protease, so how the virus chops up its proteins, and again, given for 5 days. Remdesivir is an intravenous compound that targets the way the virus replicates inside cells. This has actually been used throughout the pandemic. It was one of the first antiviral drugs that was approved for COVID-19. But more recent data, we were using it in the hospital quite a bit in the early parts of COVID-19. More recent data suggests giving it early to, again, some of those high-risk outpatients may reduce the risk of hospitalization significantly, again, in the 70 to 80% range. We have a couple of drugs that are not approved in Canada yet, but may be. So molnupiravir, which is another RNA polymerase type drug, is an oral compound where in trials have a 30% reduction in hospitalization amongst individuals that got the drug. Again, going through its approval right now with Health Canada. UV Shield, which is a monoclonal antibody. This is actually interesting because it's given prior to people being infected. So may have roles in people that are very immunocompromised where vaccine may not be adequate for them to derive protection. as a second layer. This was approved recently in the United States and is being administered there. And then we have drugs that can, also attenuate inflammation when given early. So fluvoxamine, which is an old antidepressant, which has some very profound anti-inflammatory properties and can be given orally, is now recommended in Ontario for kind of mild COVID-19 and lower risk patients. And then inhaled steroids, these are the typical puffers that people would take for asthma. Again, given early to patients, may help with their symptom reduction, cheap, easy, and available. So, old drugs that also can be repurposed for helping patients either with their symptoms or in some high-risk patients, preventing them from ending up in hospital. So programs across the country are jurisdictionally dependent. There are different programs based on different provinces. Different provinces have had rollouts. We have very centralized models. So through the Ministry of Health, which have been established in places like British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, where either a centralized pharmacy, a centralized system will then lead to these drugs being distributed in local communities through either infusion centers or through local pharmacies to actually dispense their oral medications, and again, local emergency rooms being administering doses. In Ontario, the model is actually quite decentralized, so it's up to hospital systems to actually build these in place. I'll talk about our experiences. We were the first to actually open a monoclonal clinic in Canada. British Columbia has a mail order system for their orals, so there's physicians can request the drug for the right patient. They're then taken to a central pharmacy in Vancouver, and then dispensed from that central pharmacy through FedEx to the clients in their homes. And all of these programs have different inclusion criteria. There are some similarities, though, largely high-risk unvaccinated individuals, as they mimic what happened in the clinical trials, and they're the highest risk of hospitalization. So they're age cutoff somewhere between 50 and 60 in certain medical conditions, and then immunocompromised patients, especially given the fact that they don't derive the response to a vaccine that would be considered adequate to help protect against hospitalization, but also because of the diseases that they're compromised for. They have cancer, they have organ transplants, are often also risk factors for poor outcomes for COVID-19. So I'll quickly talk about our own experience. We started St. Joe's at St. Joe's Hamilton, Canada's first monoclonal clinic. This was a pilot project through the Ministry of Health. We, a lot of local partnerships to family doctors, health networks, cancer and transplant centers. The first monoclonal antibody that was largely available for outpatients was approved in July, and we started in October. It took a long time to get all the stakeholders together and get this funded as a pilot. We have 5 to 7 day a week infusions. We've administered over 300 doses with very few hospitalizations, less than 5. An operating cost of about $20,000 a month. The drugs are procured by the federal government, so we don't pay the cost of the health systems. But using that $20,000 in CIHI data, suggesting about $23,000 per hospitalization and a 5% hospitalization rate, which is probably undercalling it, given that some of these patients probably had 10 or 15% hospitalization percentages. Just as a lower estimate, there was about 12 hospitalizations averted over the last couple of months, which, using Canadian data and incorporating the costs of our clinic in terms of healthcare human resources, was about $187,000 in healthcare savings. This is a single center, single experience. We obviously, unfortunately, Ontario was a bit slow at getting these clinics up and operational during the Omicron wave. So we supported most of Toronto as well. In order to do infusions, we were doing 12 to 15 a day just to help support the region. Thankfully now, again, these have popped up throughout Ontario, and now, patients don't have to drive as far, and our demands have gone down quite a bit as things have gotten better. But certainly in the right model, when done correctly, at a high intensity and targeting the right patients, these can be cost effective if done properly. There are some barriers, and I think there are, certain things we always have to notice. Number one is lack of education and testing. So patients don't know these are options. And we're often seeing high-risk patients when they end up in hospital as their first test as compared to when they first get symptomatic. So again, making sure that patients, especially high-risk patients, are aware of the fact that they have access to this. Linking that testing result to a time-sensitive decision, so getting them in for treatment, getting them in front of a provider that knows what they're doing in terms of treatment and knows where they can access it. Obviously, there are unvaccinated people in this group. Those individuals may be hesitant with medical interventions. A lot of compassion and outreach is still very reasonable to target these. We've had a lot of people that are very anti-vaccine that have been very willing to come, as we reach out and say, we just want to make sure that you do okay with this. We don't really care about what happened in the past. There's a little bit of an issue with tolerability for some of the oral drugs, so GI issues and a bit of a metallic taste in people's mouths, but usually can get through it with a bit of counseling. Transportation, especially for the intravenous, so people have to come to settings, especially when they're feeling unwell. They have to have someone that already has COVID to drive them if they can't drive themselves. And then finally, people are feeling unwell when they're getting this, so they're not necessarily, wanting to leave the house and see doctors, and they just want to, rest it out at home, which probably works fine for low-risk patients, but for high-risk patients, we do want to see them to make sure that they recover appropriately. So, bottom lines, COVID is with us to stay. I think we realize this. High quality investments into therapeutic options are going to help with mitigating the worst of the healthcare wave. We really do have methods to keep the highest risk patients out of hospital for the most part. And again, if used correctly, especially in efficient systems with high utilization, there's definitely a significant amount of healthcare savings that can be realized with these therapies, not only just, saving beds, but saving dollars, saving healthcare burnout, et cetera, especially in the context of a limited healthcare capacity system where, healthcare pressures can sometimes, as we've seen over the last few months, lead to community pressures in terms of economy. And then, the access and advocacy for this is going to be important, and really, again, working towards a model of keeping people out of hospital while living with COVID in the community. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or again, move on to Dr. Tong's portion of the session.
Thank you very much. Yes, we'll wait for the questions, but please keep sending them in. They are coming in, so we will have some time at the end of the session. So please send in your questions. And I will now turn to Dr. Tong to understand a little bit the situation in Australia. As Dr. Chugla has pointed out, there is still perhaps lack of awareness, lack of availability, several issues that means that these treatments aren't getting to people as well as perhaps they should. What is the situation in Australia, which has been touted as a place where things are working perhaps better? We'll hear from you. And so what is the situation there? What can we learn perhaps in terms of getting those treatments out better, both in community and in hospital settings?
Sure, thanks, Kathy. I've got just a few slides as well, so I might share my screen also, and we can quickly run through those, and I'll give a bit of the background. We usually start in Australia also by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we meet on. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nations. That's where I'm in Melbourne, and this is the traditional lands of that people group, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So look, I thought I'd just give some very basic background to Australia as well. So we're made up of 8 jurisdictions. There's 6 states and 2 territories. And this is just a map of the density of the population. As you can see, most of that sits on the eastern seaboard, mainly around New South Wales or Sydney, which being the main city, and then in Victoria, and Melbourne being the capital city of Victoria. And just to run through the waves of COVID that we've had, this is the pre-Omicron picture. I think we've been fairly lightly affected in some ways. It hasn't felt like that during this time, but in absolute numbers, Australia hasn't been hit terribly hard. So this is data up until almost the end of 2021. And you can see that we really had 3 waves, two smaller ones earlier in 2020, and then one, the Delta wave, later in 2021, where we got up to about 2,000, 2,500 cases per day. So there's still a significant strain on the health system. And you may well be aware that Melbourne is considered one of the cities that has been the most locked down in the world during this period. So we've had, I lost count of how many days, but many days where we've all been working from home and schools have been closed during that time. So probably at least, I would say, 3/4 of a year. When Omicron hit, so I've just extended the timeline here, you can see that those previous waves really fade to nothing almost. And the number of cases now peaked at a bit over 100,000 per day, in contrast to about 2,000 cases per day earlier during the Delta wave. So it's really that came about partly because of Omicron and its increased transmissibility, but also the fact that at the start of this year, Australia really decided to open up a lot further due to our reaching vaccination targets. And so our vaccination rates across the different jurisdictions, probably to summarize, is we're sitting around 93% of the adult population. And by adult population, I mean over the age of 12 in this case. So about 93, 94% have had 2 doses, and approximately 50% of that population now have had their 3rd dose as well. So I think, Australia was fairly late to come to the party in some ways, but we've caught up very rapidly and have, I think, one of the better vaccination rates in the world now, and we're very thankful for that. I'm just going to touch on how we decide what therapeutics to bring into the country, and there's a number of different, regulatory aspects that make it possible. The first is the National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force, which is a group of healthcare professionals who look through the evidence and the data that's emerging and make some recommendations. So you can see on the right here, the latest update from the 3rd of February is that there's new recommendations for molnupiravir and Paxlovid. And so this group will meet, every fortnight or so and go through the evidence and provide these new recommendations. This group actually doesn't have any regulatory authority, but they've also almost become the default, place for the recommendations at a national level. In parallel with that, there's this group called the Science and Industry Technical Advisory Group, which has got SciTag, and they provide advice directly to the Australian governments about vaccines and treatments. So it's much broader than just COVID, but obviously their focus in this last 2 years would have been COVID. And so they're the ones that provide advice to the government about procurement of therapies, and then it's up to the government to approach the industry partners and the drug companies for discussions around procurement costs and how much drug that we can bring into the country. So, for example, into our what we call our national medicine stockpile, this group would have procured, I think it's something like 700,000 courses of Paxlovid and 300,000 courses of molnupiravir. So they're the group that makes that advice about the purchasing, and this will often occur ahead of the COVID National Evidence Task Force recommendations. So the SciTag keeps an eye on what's about to come and provides advice for the earlier procurement of the vaccines and treatments. And then we also have our regulatory authority, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, who are similar to the FDA in the United States. And here's the list of drugs and the date at which they were given provisional approval to be used in Australia. So you can see remdesivir and sotrovimab and a number of other medications in that. So you really need all 3 of those things to come together before we can make use of these medications. So there's a regulatory approval here, there's the guideline recommendations, and also our country has to have bought the medications as well. And so when anything like that happens, of course, our health minister has to make a big announcement to say that, hey, Australia can treat our patients with COVID with such and such a therapy. And every time there's a bit of a song and dance about that. And then these get purchased into what's called the National Medical Stockpile. So that stockpile actually exists pre-COVID and is meant to be for, I guess, disasters. So it includes things like PPE. It can include masks, not just for COVID, but during our bushfires that we had a year and a half ago or so. You may remember that we had some terrible bushfires. So this stockpile would include things like the masks that could be distributed to communities that were affected. And the stockpile was also used during things like the H1N1 pandemic in 2009 for oseltamivir and stockpiling of those medications. So then there's specific criteria for how we can access those therapies. And once, I guess, the distribution of the treatments then gets delegated to the jurisdictional level. And similar to what Dr. Chugla was saying, I think there's quite a lot of variation in exactly how that occurs by jurisdiction and how that occurs at the hospital level as well, and that down to the individual hospital level. Nonetheless, we all have to make a request to access, for example, remdesivir, and there's a form that we all have to fill in that gets submitted to the local hospital, as well as to the central stock, which is kept often at a particular pharmacy in each jurisdiction. So this will vary by the medication and so on, but generally this is the process by which we access it. And as Dr. Chugla said, there's all kinds of barriers to, that we need to overcome in terms of the monoclonal antibodies. That's been in some ways quite difficult in that we've had to set up these infusion centres. And you can imagine the difficulties of getting people tested in time, having that result, having them then contact the appropriate healthcare provider to get them into this infusion centre. And there's only been a small number of infusion centres across my state, at least in Victoria. So that's, to me, been a key barrier to that. In terms of the oral antivirals, we haven't actually really got access to that yet. It has been all approved, but the distribution pathways haven't been worked out just yet. I'm very much hoping that it will go through the primary healthcare providers rather than through a hospital system. And I was interested to see in Canada the means by which it could be FedExed to patients, and I thought that looks pretty helpful and pretty novel in some ways. We haven't quite gotten to that point yet. I guess my last two slides, and I'll take questions later, to think about the fact that all these clinical trials which have been done have been in populations which have not been vaccinated and were all pre-Omicron, and therefore it's reasonably hard in some ways to extrapolate to the situation we are in now, where the majority of our patients are vaccinated and all the infections Omicron, and whether you can extrapolate all that data that we've got now to the current situation is to me a little bit in question. This is some table from British Columbia, actually. It's the kind of best risk table that I've found in the world, much better than what we have in Australia at the moment, that I think really helps to say, who's actually at highest risk and who can we best target these therapies to. And I think the therapy is not cheap, and there is limited supply of many of them. And I think it's important that we do try and wisely and prudently target it to the appropriate patients, and not give it to someone who actually has a very low risk of developing severe COVID. And for example, a person who's had 2 doses of the vaccine, who's aged in their 50s or 60s, but has no other risk factors, is actually, in the current climate in Australia at least, probably fairly low risk for deterioration. And whether we should be using these drugs for those patients, I think, is a bit problematic, even though they were included in those clinical trials. And that brings me to my last slide, that comes from the Financial Times and John Murdoch, showing that the infection fatality ratio, at least in England, for COVID has really declined over the course of this pandemic. So this is that red line, And starting from early on, we're kind of saying this is the 100% mark for the infection fatality ratio, you can see that that's really dropped away by 4 to 5 times. And the infection fatality ratio now is getting actually close to that of influenza when we look at it at a whole population level. And that's largely because of high rates of vaccination in our populations, particularly in the vulnerable groups. And then you add in the third dose, add in Omicron, which is probably a little less severe intrinsically even, and we're seeing a very different picture now to what we had before. So I think all this needs to be factored into how we actually use and distribute these medications. I guess one of the questions that Kathy asked was about education of the public. We've tried to do that, but it certainly hasn't gotten nearly as much press as vaccination. I think that's not entirely inappropriate in that vaccines are really our first line defense against COVID. But certainly for vulnerable groups now, I think we need to work much harder on that messaging so that they're aware to get tested early if they do develop symptoms, and to be aware that if tested early and they're positive, there certainly are options that help to mitigate their risk of hospitalisation. I might stop there, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tong. Very interesting presentations in terms of obviously the impact on hospitalizations and deaths and how these treatments can mitigate those. I think now I'd like to turn to Mark and ask him about the impact on the business community, because we have this additional tool now that's available to us. And I'd like to ask you what you think these treatments could represent potentially for return to a more normal business life and stimulation of economic recovery and return to growth.
No, well, thanks for that, Kathy. And I should say it was really interesting to see both Dr. Tong and Dr. Chagla's presentation. It's been probably at least a decade and a half since I've talked about regression tables, so I'm glad that someone on the call knows how to still do those, because it's not me anymore. But I think just to set a bit of context, I mean, it has been a trying 2 years for a lot of businesses to navigate through the pandemic, and I get how that feels like it's a bit of a throwaway comment that you have to make, but particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, they don't have the if I can call it employee bench strength to be able to manage absenteeism in their workforce. If a small business, if one person is out, the rest of the operation really does feel that. And I think some of what we're seeing now, particularly around labor shortages and supply chain challenges, have been some of it are kind of structural economic issues that have always been there, but some of them have been exacerbated by the Omicron wave, which has been more infectious. And so again, more people are staying home, which is what they should be doing. And so having, treatments like this, I think, are another tool in the toolkit. And one of the things that was really interesting to see actually this week was the Council of Chief Medical Officers, which for those on the webinar who don't know this, this essentially is, Theresa Tam, the federal chief medical officer, and her provincial counterparts actually had a joint statement that came out yesterday talking about the need to adapt our pandemic response. And so some of the things that they said in their statement that really stood out to me was one, a recognition that we have to remain nimble in our response and respond to new risks in both a appropriate and proportionate manner, and that the goal is actually minimizing serious illness and overall deaths and minimizing social disruption. So I thought that was an interesting comment to make. I mean, the statement also touched on to having a more sustainable approach to the long-term management of COVID, and picking up on what I said a moment ago. It wasn't them taking it from me, it's more me taking it from them, this idea about having lots of tools in the toolbox. And so whether it's the vaccinations, the treatments, the surveillance, better public health infrastructure, there's a whole kind of series of things that we need to have here to be able to get through this. I mean, most people, I think, agree we're going hopefully out of the pandemic and into the endemic phase, although, Dr. Tong and Dr. Chagla may want to correct me on that. I just go by what's in mainstream media, but this is what I'm told is the changing context that we're in. And so if I think even too about like the announcement today by the federal government around border reopening, part of why I think it is the right time to reopen borders is not because, we just have community transmission of Omicron, but also too because we have other treatments available like this. And so, when the border measures were first brought in, we had no clue what was going on. This was a new virus. I mean, don't forget, 2 years ago, we were all like, sanitizing our groceries when we brought them in the house. It all seems kind of silly now in hindsight with this sort of hygiene theater that we had. But the vaccinations combined with these sort of therapeutic tools are, quite important for us to be able to also have international travel, interprovincial travel in the case of Canada, for people to move across borders, for people to go into the workplace, absenteeism to be reduced. So I think the whole suite of it is there. And also too, we don't know kind of, how long the vaccine efficacy is going to continue. So, booster shots, and it's going to take time to this. And again, how do we kind of fill the gaps in there for different, age demographics as well. The one thing, I mean, Kathy, if I could just take a bit of a different track to sort of talk a little bit about the sort of innovation piece of this. And so one of the things that, I've been spending a lot of time working on over the last year is this WTO TRIPS waiver piece. And so for those of you who don't know, the World Trade Organization has a number of agreements that govern, trading rules that countries have to implement that are members of the WTO, to kind of put it simply. One of them is called TRIPS, TRIPS, and this is the agreement that governs intellectual property protection rules. And the best way to think of it is it sets like a minimum bar standard that WTO members have to implement in order to protect intellectual property within their domestic intellectual property laws. There's a lot of people that have been opposed to the WTO TRIPS agreement for a long time, and those particular groups, and South Africa and India have been the main proponents in the most recent iteration, are seeking to use the justification of distributing vaccines as a reason for why we need to temporarily put aside the TRIPS protections and set aside kind of IP rights for those products. One of the things that's in the proposal, although it is mostly aimed at vaccines, is actually also references any COVID, therapeutics, diagnostics, or treatment medicines. And so I think, all the work that's gone into developing, products like this, it really underscores, I think, the important role that the legal framework plays in developing these products. I mean, it's a lot of risks that companies take on in the development of the drugs. And so I think just from an industry standpoint, in terms of what the Canadian Chamber has been working on, I think there's an interesting dovetail there. And certainly, I think it speaks to the importance of, the role of the Canadian government in, maintaining that protection for an innovation ecosystem. But I know that's a little bit of a side tangent from what you asked before, but I think just, hearing the presentation about therapeutics and the treatments really made me kind of think about some of the other more macro level debates that are going on at the moment.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. And speaking of innovation, maybe I'll bounce off of that a little bit and just ask Dr. Chagla, are there any treatments being developed here in Canada as we speak?
There are a couple of projects with monoclonal antibodies. They're not necessarily kind of right to market yet. The one major issue that's happened with Omicron is that the monoclonal antibody market has largely changed. Unfortunately, Omicron has a lot of mutations in its spike protein, where these antibodies target. There are, in terms of vaccines, certainly a lot of work being done in Canada. The Medicago vaccine, for example, is a made in Canada vaccine that theoretically could be manufactured in Canada. That is going through Health Canada approval right now, and it has some benefits of being, a little less controversial than mRNA vaccines. These are viral-like protein vaccines made from tobacco plants, so maybe a bit more tolerable for people who don't necessarily want to get vaccinated with mRNA vaccines. And some work done even at McMaster on inhaled vaccines, which is going to be really interesting, considering the next step is really getting a sterilizing vaccine, so one that targets kind of where the virus lands, and also huge global implications in terms of the ability to transport and administer vaccines if it can be given through an inhaler, through a dry powder. There's a lot of innovation there for global vaccine equity and global vaccine supply.
Thank you. So we're moving into the question period. Again, I remind you to go on slido.com. That's SLIDO.com. The code number for this meeting is 345 321, but I do have a couple of questions coming in. And one of them touches upon whether these treatments actually work for people suffering from the long-term COVID, which is increasingly getting attention as time passes. And we're seeing, people, actually very healthy people, relatively healthy people. Seems demographics are a lot for women between 30 and 60, typically very fit people, and who just recover supposedly, but don't recover. So have any of these treatments been tried or are promising for that type of disease, which can be, to Mark's point about, productivity and absenteeism? I mean, there you can be really talking about long-term disability, and it would be, very painful for the person and also, very damaging for the economy. I don't know if Dr. Tong or Dr. Chagley, you want to address whether you're aware of any treatments.
I can have a
go ahead,
go
Dr.
first.
Tom. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I know there are some clinical trials looking at monoclonal antibodies. There have been some anecdotal reports from people around that. Obviously, Paxlovid and molnupiravir are very, very early to the market, and so there hasn't necessarily been that much exploration as the drug has just started to trickle into the world. But I don't know if Dr. Tong is aware of anything else.
I'm not particularly. I think it's important to acknowledge that what you're saying, Kathy, and there will be a burden of disease due to long COVID, and it's really important that we work out how best to help those people, those patients. I think we also are at a pretty early stage in understanding what causes long COVID. What the actual pathology behind it is. You can imagine these antiviral medicines, as Dr. Chugler mentioned, they're very much act at that very early stage of infection when there's viral replication. So I think it's highly unlikely that viral replication is still going to be happening that far down the track, at least to the degree that it will be causing the pathology. And so I think at the moment, our efforts should be in working out exactly what's going on with long COVID, and there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity as well there, so that we can best target the various therapies that we might want to try. Now, of course, you can be running trials in parallel, but I think as we do that, it's important we understand the underlying pathogenesis as well.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a question which I think could be interesting for all three of you to consider. So the question is, should vaccine mandates continue indefinitely to complement any new Canadian strategy or any strategy for early COVID-19 treatment? So should vaccine mandates continue? Anybody want to take that on?
This is obviously a very uncontroversial topic. Obviously, in Canada, obviously, there's been a lot of polarization around vaccine mandates, and it sounds like over the last week, many provinces are talking about disassembling them as a long-term plan, or at least a short-term solution. I think we had a lot of data in the Delta era around vaccine mandates. The fact that vaccines were very good at preventing even people from having symptomatic COVID-19. There was some data around downward transmission. Even if they did have symptomatic COVID-19, that was reduced. It's getting much more murky now in terms of that justification. So we do know 2 doses definitely offers a significant amount of protection from severe disease. I think Dr. Tong put up that nice risk assessment where 2 doses in a young person is pretty much under 0.1% risk of hospitalization in an 18-year-old. But long-term data really does show 2 doses in terms of its prevention of transmission or people getting infected is not adequate. And in some studies gets to about the same as an unvaccinated person. 3 doses does push things up. Canada, Ontario data suggests about 60%. That was cut off at about 60 days. The UK and UK data suggesting maybe around 40% at 15 weeks. So there is a benefit there. But it just gets really murky in the context of probably 30% of people that got Omicron recently on 2 doses, where there's even more, 2 dose plus people who got Omicron, where the guidance is to wait 3 months to get your booster. And the fact that we have 90% of people that have at least had their series of vaccines as adults. So, the gains, I think, from pushing the vaccine mandates are starting to become much more minimal. The complexity in terms of, making sure people are up to date on their vaccines, but also dealing with natural infection are getting very complicated. And so this is where I think the provinces are looking to say, okay, I think we've gotten as much uptake as we can with vaccine mandates. And obviously we're seeing a lot of discontent around the country as well. And, is it worth it to keep pushing and pushing versus, releasing and just kind of allowing for these other systems to help prevent serious disease amongst those high risk unvaccinated people as well?
Mark, what do you think oh, I see you opened your mic, so I don't have to press you for an answer to that. But from businesses' perspectives, at least here in Quebec, it's interesting because they are doing away with some vaccine mandates, but they are allowing some all businesses, if they wish to continue to impose them. So, I'm curious on your perspective of what that means for businesses.
Yeah, so on the issue of like, should they or should they not? I mean, the chamber doesn't have like a singular position on this, and I think the answer that I would give to whoever asked this is probably along the lines of kind of what we said to date, which is that like for those businesses that do decide to have vaccine mandates, it's really important for governments to provide clear sort of rules of the road in terms of what like businesses can and can't do, what they can and can't ask of their employees, because it is a fairly gray area for companies. And certainly any of the lawyers that I've talked to about this, they like to always fall back on the jurisprudence is still being developed as we speak. And so there's not a whole lot of clear cut things for companies to look to. Like one of the things, for instance, that we were quite happy to see the government to commit to was actually introducing legislation at the federal level that would help provide some of that clarity. The one thing I would say though, just thinking about what's been going on in Saskatchewan and seeing some of the information that one of our chambers out there did, I believe it was the Saskatoon Chamber, had been surveying their members, and certainly transition times were another big piece that companies had articulated. They would want as much notice as possible to whether it's communicated to their customers or communicated to their employees, rather than having things change abruptly on a dime.
Right. And I have one last question here. Dr. Chagla, you touched on it, but just maybe also to give Dr. Tong an opportunity to respond. Will we see boosters becoming a little bit like the flu shot in the future as we adapt to different strains and the evolution of the disease?
I'll try. I think possibly, but there's no evidence to support that at this stage. The two, and then I think certainly to me it's probably going to be at least a 3-dose vaccine. It's not clear how long I think antibody levels will wane. People will become more vulnerable to at least getting infected, symptomatic infection. But whether your protection against severe disease and hospitalization, that may actually last for a lot longer because of the various other parts of the immune systems, not just the antibodies. So I think I'm really happy to wait until there's more data generated on that question. It may well be that with things like Omicron, the increased transmissibility, maybe our boosting will come from just natural infection as well. You've had 3 doses of a vaccine. If you get occasionally exposed and your immune system's exposed to the virus, it will develop, be boosted in itself in that sense. So I think let's wait to see.
Dr. Chagla, any additional
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree. There was some initial data. I mean, I think everyone's talked about, mRNA vaccines being changed into, Omicron vaccines, et cetera. This is really difficult for companies too, because of the fact that, by the time Omicron came and by the time you can manufacture a vaccine, make sure it's safe, distribute the population, 50% of the population already got Omicron. So, what's the yield of updating it? So, that there's that point. Plus, there's a little bit of preclinical data that's been done in animals around an Omicron vaccine that really suggests that if you've given, your original COVID vaccine for mRNA, that you may not get as great a response to Omicron as you would like. Again, animal data, so it's so hard to describe in humans. So it may be more difficult to kind of adapt our vaccine as we would like. But there is a lot of hope in different vaccine platforms, as I think I talked about. There's a lot of looked at mucosal vaccines, the ones that target the nose and the respiratory tract, which may be the kind of long-term strategy for transmission reduction more than anything else. And I think there are certainly works from the company in terms of the companies for mRNA vaccines also looking at combining these vaccines with typical vaccines like influenza and developing an RSV vaccine. And so perhaps is a yearly series, but also not wasting that opportunity to give a yearly vaccine to also help with alternative respiratory diseases rather than a single focus on the COVID-19 respiratory disease. So still lots of promise for sure, but I don't think anyone can predict what vaccination is going to look like in 6 months to a year.
Kathy, what I would just sort of jump in and add is that, I don't want to question the focus that governments have had on vaccination. I mean, it's been like 110% the right thing to do to focus on, a triple, dose sequencing for, Canadians. What I would say though, and this kind of picks up where I was starting with my opening remarks about the Council of Chief Public Health Officers talking about the toolkit that we all like talking so much about. One thing that I think is really important for governments to do a better job on is talking about what is out there to supplement vaccines. I think we want to be crystal clear that these aren't meant to replace; they are meant to work alongside. And so I think that's an important message for the federal government to talk about from the top, because certainly a lot of these types of treatments have very much flown under the radar to be sort of understated about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we heard also that obviously you have to have access to these treatments very quickly, which means you have to have access to testing very quickly, which has also been a bit of an issue. So the availability of other tools, to everyone's point here, beyond the vaccine probably needs to be, ramped up and reconsidered, so that we have the full arsenal of these tools in order to move back to some form of normal life. So that sort of wraps it up for us here. So I'd like to really thank all three of you for very interesting, lively discussion. So thank you very much, Mark, Dr. Chagla, and Dr. Tong for your participation this afternoon. And enjoy the rest of the day in Australia, and have a nice evening here in Canada. Thank you.